Welcome to Cook the Garden Podcast, your weekly audio source for delicious and easy garden fresh recipes and growing tips. I'm your host, Janine Grays. Let's cook the garden. Hey, Cook the Garden family. If you're a tea lover like I am, or curious to learn more about teas, you're going to love today's episode. We have our very first guest of the season, and I'm so excited. Nicole Wilson is a tea writer and educator who shares her knowledge and love of tea on her website, teaformeplease.com. Her site covers everything from reviews of specialty teas and products to over 1,000 informational tea articles. In 2018, she won the World Tea Award for the Best Tea Blog. Nicole also teaches classes, and she's about to launch a tea course that covers all the basics. In today's episode, Nicole is spilling all the tea. She's sharing some insider tips and tricks of brewing the most delicious tea, plus she's sharing one of her favorite recipes. I can't wait for you guys to hear this episode. Let's get into it. Welcome, Nicole. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, like I mentioned, I'm starting this podcast off, I feel like, on such a positive high note and something different. Normally, our listeners are used to, kind of hearing me talk about a recipe and talking about gardening and how to grow certain things in your garden and eating seasonally. And this, season, I wanted to introduce the audience to just different folks who can come to us and talk to us about different foods. How can you grow it, or how can you incorporate it into your meals or your everyday lives? And so, when I saw your profile, I was immediately drawn because I love tea. I'm a tea drinker. Um, but there's so much I know I can learn from teas in general, because I know there are so many different types of teas. So I'm really looking forward to jumping into this conversation with you. But I would love to start off with a fun fact. And so, since you're the tea guru, I'd love to know, I'm sure our audience would love to know, what is your favorite tea and how do you like to enjoy it?
It's a super tough question. There's so many different kinds of tea, and I love them all. And it almost kind of depends on my mood or the weather as to like what I want to drink. But my all-time favorite tea is a Chinese oolong called Huang Zhijiang. And it has no flavor or anything added to it, but it tastes like gardenia's smell. And it's just the most wonderful floral flavor. And it's really just always been my kind of mainstay tea.
Ooh, that sounds lovely. So, how do you like to drink it? I mean, is it just I don't know. Do you like to pair it with something else, or how do you love to enjoy it?
So for Chinese oolongs, there's a particular way of brewing tea called gung fu, where instead of brewing like a big pot like you might see in kind of like a British style tea service, you brew it in a really small vessel. But instead of brewing it once, you're going to brew it multiple times. And each time you brew it, the flavor's slightly different. So it really becomes like a whole experience. And that's my favorite way to brew because of that, is it just really highlights the tea and lets you experience the aromas. I don't tend to eat with my tea, partly because I want to experience all of those different nuances.
Gotcha. It's so interesting that you say that, because I almost feel like for you, it's almost an experience, right?
Absolutely.
I grew up drinking tea. I come from a Caribbean family, and we drink teas with, I say we, but in my family, I mean, people enjoy their tea different ways. But I kind of grew up adding milk to my tea. Have you ever heard of that, or is it just like us and we're
Yeah,
weird?
no, that's how I grew up. My mom still drinks more tea than I do, but it's just your kind of typical black tea bags from the grocery store with milk and sugar.
Pretty much.
And that's the great thing about tea is there's so many different ways you can do it. There's really no right or wrong. So like sometimes people like when they know what I do, they almost are like ashamed to admit that they drink their tea with milk or sugar, and I'm like, it's fine.
Okay, okay, so I
Yeah,
feel much better because
absolutely.
I'm like, "Oh,
Yeah,
I'm kind of embarrassed here."
not at all.
Awesome, awesome. So, like I said, I was just so intrigued with your story. Can you kind of go into what inspired you to, become a tea educator and a tea writer, and how did you get started? What inspired you to get started?
Yeah, so I really love tea. I always have. So I would drink a cup of tea every night before bed with my mom. And then when I went to college, my classmates were drinking coffee for morning classes or staying up to write papers, and I didn't like coffee. So I started exploring tea a little more. That just trying different things so I can have something to warm me up on a winter day on campus. And at that time, I was kind of just searching for more information, and I found a website who was looking for staff tea reviewers, where they were like, "You write about the tea, and we'll send it to you for free." And I was like, "That sounds like a great deal." So I wound up writing for them for a couple of years, where I got this really great early education, where I got to try hundreds of different teas from all over the world all at once.
Wow.
And so eventually, I started my own blog, actually as a way to back up the work I was doing for them, just in case like their website was ever shut down, I wouldn't lose all of that. And it kind of just took on a life of its own from there. Initially I was doing a lot of product reviews, just kind of, learning as I went. And then, as I would never consider myself necessarily like an expert or a person who knows all the things there is to know. But, it then turned into me then sharing the knowledge that I gained with other people and trying to do it in like a really, approachable and fun way, to make it a little bit less intimidating.
Absolutely. No, I could totally, totally resonate with that piece as well. I've always said that I'm not a gardening expert, like I'm really just sharing my experience. But as time goes by, it's like you almost become that expert because people are now looking to you for questions, and answers to their questions. So it's really neat to see that evolution. Kind of going back to when you mentioned your college days and how, I have a college student, by the way. She's a tea drinker. She's not a coffee drinker, but going back to that and kind of cramming and staying up late for that caffeine. One of our community members, Cassie, in our Facebook group, I actually let them know, like, hey, I'm interviewing this award winning tea educator and writer. What tea questions do you guys have? And she submitted a really good question. Cassie wanted to know what types of teas have the most caffeine.
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's kind of a loaded one in a way. Um, the type of tea actually doesn't determine how much caffeine there is. So there's basically all tea comes from the same plant, called Camellia sinensis, and it's how those leaves are processed that determine what type it becomes. What really influences the caffeine content is more what part of the tea plant is used. So a lot of emphasis is often put on just like the new buds that are barely opened, for your really high quality teas. And that's actually where caffeine is concentrated the most because it acts as a bug repellent, for the tea plant. So your
Wow.
teas that have higher bud content are also going to have a higher tea content, higher caffeine content. So that often would be like a really fresh green tea. Matcha is a tea that a lot of people do drink for its caffeine because it's a powder. You're basically consuming all of the tea plant at once and a lot of it. So it does tend to hit you faster than like a steeped tea would.
Oh my goodness, that's so interesting. Okay, because you're totally educating me right now. When you broke it down in that in that way. Because, I think myself and a lot of people think of tea, like different types of teas as, okay, this one, has caffeine or this one doesn't, but it's not really so much that, it's more so the parts of the leaves is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, like the larger leaves that are lower down on the plant are going to be lower in caffeine because they don't need the protection from insects like a tender bud would.
Awesome. Wow. Okay. I tell you, I am loving this right now because I'm learning so much. So since we're still on the topic, can you share maybe some of the different types, like as far as like how they differ in terms of taste or packaging? I know there's loose tea, excuse me, versus bag teas. Can you kind of go into that maybe a little bit? I know that's probably a loaded question too, but
Yeah, not at all. There's basically, you know, set categories of tea that, it's hard to categorize sometimes because, there's always gray areas with certain things. But typically they go from like white tea would be your lightest. So it has like the leaves are really just dried, not a whole lot else is done to them. So it has like a really light, almost kind of floral flavor to it. Green tea, the leaves are kind of pan roasted or steamed. So it does almost get more of like a veggie taste to it. And then oolong is the leaves are allowed to oxidize. And that's what brings out like a chemical change in the leaves. And that can cause floral aromas. And oolong is a really big category. So you can go from something you would almost think is a green tea to something you would almost think is a black tea. So it's really a diverse category. So that's one that, can almost be tricky because there's so many different kinds of oolongs and they can taste so many different ways. And the black tea is probably what people are more familiar with, where the leaves are fully oxidized. So that's what gives it like the darker color as well as the stronger taste. And so loose leaf is kind of like the original way of drinking tea, for a really long time. It was actually powdered when people first started drinking tea, and then it eventually changed to where they stopped powdering the leaves and they would, steep them the way we do today. And then tea bags were invented kind of along the lines of the Industrial Revolution as a way to just make it quicker and easier to make tea. If you're working in a factory, you're not going to be messing around with, loose leaves and all of that. You want something really simple. And typically, tea bags are made with lower quality tea, but it's for a few reasons. So it's not necessarily like a snobby thing, but tea bags are meant to make your tea quickly and easily. So the tea leaves are often kind of broken up into small pieces, and that's what allows them to infuse quickly because more of the leaf is in contact with the water. And so you're just not going to get that same effect with something that's like a full whole leaf. The flavor is going to be much less strong that way. And especially if you're intending to add milk and sugar, that's actually something that you want because you want something that's going to be able to hold up its flavor even when you're adding things to it.
okay, perfect. Thank you for breaking that down. I think a lot of people sometimes I'm a bagged tea type of person. Because I feel like I'm always on the go and I need something quickly. And, so I'm glad to know that I'm just not like, sometimes I'm embarrassed to admit, like, I'm the bag tea person over here. But there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that. And I think, it's just different strokes for different folks. Sometimes if I do have time where I just want to sit back and relax and I have time on my hands, I will go for the loose leaves, and that's fine too. I think knowing what works best for you at that time, and just kind of playing around with different teas, I really really enjoy that. Um, you talked a little bit about the brewing part. Let's dig into that a little bit more. Do you have any tips on how to properly brew tea to get the best taste?
Yeah, so it does depend on what tea you're making, and kind of what experience you want to have. So, like a lot of people will ask me, like, what's the way to make tea? And there really isn't one way. But I like to think about it as proportions. That basically by changing the different variables of making tea, like the water temperature and how long you're brewing it, is how you're going to kind of curate the kind of drinking experience you want to have. So if you want something more mellow and you don't want bitterness, you're going to use cooler water. You're going to brew it for less time. If you want something really punchy and strong, you're going to use more leaves. You're going to brew it for longer, and you're going to use hotter water. So it really does depend a lot on kind of what you want. But the one tip that I would say for a lot of people, I always hear from people that they don't like green tea because it's bitter. And it's almost always because they're using fully boiling water. And green tea definitely does become very bitter if you're using water that's too hot. So adjusting that is, I find, kind of the best troubleshooting to make sure that you're getting the best taste you can out of your tea.
Ooh, that's interesting. I never thought about that. I just always assumed that you want it piping hot, but wow, I didn't think about the temp of the water. Can you dig into that a little bit more too? Like
Yeah.
yeah,
So
let's get into it.
caffeine has a bitter taste. And in addition to that, tea also contains, tannins, antioxidants, which are all things that we do, experience as bitter tastes. And so the hotter the water, and the longer you brew, the more of those components you're going to extract. So I find sometimes I have people that, they brew it for longer because they think they're going to get more good stuff. But it's not necessarily the case. So it's really, every tea is a little bit different. So some of it is just kind of experimenting and trying a different type of tea too, that the one you have may just not be the one that you like. But it definitely, I always say start with the tea company that you got the leaves from. Their directions are kind of how they intend you to make it. And then you can always adjust from there. So if you find it too strong, you can dial things back. If you find it not strong enough, you can always, amp things up a little bit.
Gotcha, gotcha. I wanted to, since we're on the topic, I wanted to also ask another question from one of our club members, our Facebook group members for Cook the Garden. Amy wanted to know, and I think you've already kind of touched on it a little bit, but are there any other additional benefits of brewing loose tea versus tea bags? Are there any other like additional maybe points that we haven't mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so I would say the main advantage with loose leaf is that you have the control. Tea bags are kind of like a pre-measured thing where you're only getting a set amount of leaves in that tea bag, usually about 2 grams, depending on the brand. Where with loose leaf, you have that option of really controlling how you're brewing your tea, how much leaves you're using. A lot of tea drinkers that do brew loose leaf tea, they'll actually measure their tea leaves on a scale, almost like you see like the high-end coffee people do, just as a way of really being able to dial in the way they're brewing their tea to make sure that they're making it the way they like it to taste.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes total sense. Thank you for digging into that a little bit further. So as you know, we are also a cooking community. We love to cook around here. So can you suggest what are ways that we can incorporate tea into our cooking or even baking? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of different ways you can incorporate tea into cooking. I personally am more of a baker than a cooker, so I love to do that with tea. I drive my husband crazy because I'm always putting tea in everything. He's always suspicious when I make sweets. One of my favorite ways is to actually infuse tea in butter, because then you can strain the leaves out of the butter and then use that butter in cookies or muffins, whatever recipe you're making, and the baked good then will then have the flavor of the tea in it.
Oh my gosh, that sounds
Yeah,
amazing. That
definitely.
sounds amazing. I'm gonna have to try that. I'm not really too much into baking. Actually, it's so funny. For Christmas, my husband got me a KitchenAid stand mixer. Um, I've been asking for it, guys. So it's not one of those. Here you go, wife. Here's this kitchen appliance. I've been actually just fangirling over one of those. So I've definitely plan on trying that because I just want to like go nuts with the baking because I've got my new mixer. So thank you
Definitely.
for mentioning that. And
I
I know
love
you.
my KitchenAid. It was one of the first gifts my husband ever bought me.
I love it. Okay, good, good. I didn't want anyone thinking like, oh, okay, like your husband is giving you this,
Yeah.
gift, this appliance, but it was actually a really sweet gift, and I'm really, really excited to do more baking. Now I'm really excited. Before it's just like, oh, okay, whatever, but now it's like, okay, I'm going to be baking cakes, breads. I want to start making my own butter, and I'm in a KitchenAid group, and I put out a question like, has anyone ever made butter out of their KitchenAid? And they're like, oh my god, yes. So I'll be infusing my fresh herbs, and maybe, I don't know, have you made your own butter with tea leaves? Is that
I
even possible?
haven't made my own butter with tea leaves, but that does sound very good. I'll have to give it a try.
Yeah, we may have to try.
Yeah,
We may have to come back for a part two.
there you go.
Awesome, awesome. So for those of us, or for those interested in growing their own tea, I don't grow my own tea yet. I do want to incorporate that into my garden. But what are some different ways that teas can be grown in your garden? And do you have any tips for successfully growing and harvesting tea plants at home?
Yeah, so I definitely, it's much easier to grow herbal tea at home. So things like mint, sage are, pretty commonly grown in gardens, and they're pretty easy to cultivate. Tea plants, the Camellia sinensis, on the other hand, is a bit finicky. I've always kind of amazed at how much tea is grown in the world and in so many different places because it really can be a bit of a difficult plant. They like acidic soil. So I had a tea farmer once told me that if blueberries will grow in your soil, then tea should do well in it because they kind of
Mm,
prefer the same things. But they're very picky about how much water they get, how much sun they get. So I have two that are in pots because I don't have like a backyard. And they can be pretty finicky. It's interesting because I have two different varieties. One came from Sochi in Russia, and then one came from South Korea. The Russian plant hated the summers here in New Jersey. It was way too hot. It became very dramatic. The Korean was fine. But then now that the winter is here, the Russian plant is doing great. The Korean plant looks not so hot.
okay, okay. Yeah, it's funny how that happens, and I'm glad you mentioned that. You talked about herbs a little bit, and that's something I do have. I grow quite a bit of herbs. So I've done mint teas. I have a moringa, and I'm experimenting with that. It's kind of a younger tree. All kinds of herbs. So I was interested. Actually, I've been kind of researching the tea plants that you're mentioning. I can't pronounce them. I'm not even going to try. But it's so interesting to hear you say that they could be a little moody, a little. So it should be interesting. Where did you get your, like? Did you actually get yours from, like, Russia and the
Yeah,
places
I
that you
got them
mentioned?
from a nursery that's located in Georgia. So they have just like all different varieties from different places in the world, and they've been growing tea for a long time. So I feel like they're called Camellia Forest is their name,
Okay.
and so they're really great. They ship it and pack it well. They arrived quickly with like no damage or anything. I don't recommend buying seeds, especially from places like eBay or Amazon or Etsy, just because you
Mm,
really never know what you're going to get.
exactly.
Um, and it may not be what it was advertised as, where, they're like a reputable place that, everything's clearly labeled and they know what, their plants are.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you said that. And that's part of the reason why one thing I do feel really passionate about is knowing, who you're dealing with, where as far as like your farmers, your sources, know where your plants and your seeds are coming from, sparking those relationships, just knowing where they could, because, like what you said, sometimes ordering from these sites, you really don't know what you're getting. So I'm really glad you said that. This is a really great segue to another question. that I've kind of been thinking about. And how can we ensure that the tea that we're consuming is sustainably sourced and ethically produced? Is that something that you talk about also on your blog?
Yeah, I definitely do. It's something I'm passionate about. A lot of tea comes from places where the it's not ethical. The workers are not paid a living wage. They live a very hard life, and I almost kind of look at, you do get what you pay for. If your tea costs, $3 for a box of like 100 tea bags, you have to think about like how much is that money trickling down the supply chain. So when I'm buying tea, I do try to look for the shortest supply chain that I can. I want somebody who actually went to the point of origin, talked to the farmer, bought the tea directly from them, instead of like somebody who bought it from a person who bought it from a person who bought it from a person,
Right.
because that all adds onto your price tag, but doesn't necessarily help the person who actually made your tea.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. 100%. I'm so glad you mentioned that. And it makes sense, so it almost makes you think differently for as a consumer, and taking more control um, as to what it is that you're buying, and what it is you're consuming. So I really appreciate you going into that. Um, so let's switch it up. Let's have a little bit of fun because, as you know, on this podcast, I share all types of recipes from the garden. And I would like to switch and flip the script a little bit. And I would love for you to share a favorite recipe. I know that you have a really awesome recipe that you're going to share with us. And for those of you listening, don't worry, I will definitely put a link in the show notes. But Nicole, can you share what your favorite recipe is? It could be tea, it could be anything you want.
Absolutely. So one of my favorite recipes is also one of my simplest because I love something that takes as little effort as possible for a great end result. So I love making my own matcha whipped cream. So it's a recipe that like I wrote for my blog, several years ago, but I also included it in the book that I wrote last year. And it's as simple as you can get. It's basically just, heavy cream, a little bit of sugar, and matcha green tea. And it's so easy to just whip up and add to desserts and look like you are a super impressive expert.
Seriously, like it's so simple, but it's actually kind of really fancy
Yeah,
and
yeah,
impressive.
exactly.
It's impressive. So, what do you serve with that? I know you can get pretty creative, but what are some of the things that you've served with
Yeah,
it?
so I love putting it on cheesecake, really ice cream, like really any case that
Mm.
you would use whipped cream. The matcha just adds like it's vegetal, but not overwhelming because you have the other ingredients in there. So it just adds like a really fresh flavor that I find really balances well with sweets.
Ooh. Oh my goodness. Okay. So I'm definitely going to make this, y'all. I'm going to make this and post it on social media. And you guys can see how easy it is and how
Yes.
delicious. Well, I can tell you how delicious it'll be.
Your
I wish
new
I could share
KitchenAid
with
is
everyone.
great for making it.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay. I'm super excited about that. So thank you so much, Nicole, for sharing that recipe. And like I mentioned, I'll go ahead and put that information in the show notes for those of you who'd like to make that recipe as well. So we are actually coming to the end of this amazing conversation. I've learned so much and I kind of have a new outlook on tea, which is, really amazing. So I've always loved tea, but now I just kind of feel like more educated about it. So I really appreciate you for sharing your knowledge, Nicole. I will definitely include all of your information in the show notes. But I'm just curious, can you let us know, like, do you have any upcoming projects in the works and anything that you would like to share?
Yeah, so I'm kind of in the process of putting together my first online tea course as a tea educator. That's kind of my bigger goal for everything. So I'm kind of working on putting together like a T101, just like a basic introduction course, and have it online so that way it's accessible to everyone. I do some in-person classes, but it's not always easy for everyone to travel, and people live, in many different places. So I think it'll be really nice to be able to offer a resource for everyone, to be able to access and learn more about tea.
Oh, absolutely. And I love the fact that it's virtual. So you can literally be anywhere in the world and still have access to the course. That's really amazing. Also, as far as the course you'd mentioned, it's kind of more of like a 101 basics type thing. So anyone can take this, right? So it could be just someone who's interested in learning more about tea, or maybe a foodie, or someone who wants to like up their tea game. What's the typical student for this course?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I find usually the typical student is somebody who, maybe you drink tea bags, you like to drink tea, but you don't really know that much and you wish you knew more. But it can be intimidating that sometimes taking a more in-depth course can be really intimidating, and you almost feel like, oh, I'm not ready for that yet. Where,
Yes.
to have it just be, factual and interesting, but not too much information also, so you're not overwhelmed, I think is a really great way to get started.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited for that course coming up. I'm sure it's going to be so super valuable for so many people. So, Nicole, tell us where we can find all of this information, whether it's someone wants to learn more about your books, or just wants to go through your blog, or they want to know about this course. Where can we find you?
Yeah, so my website is teaformeplease.com, and you can find me on pretty much every social media platform as at Tea for Me Please, except for TikTok because someone took my name, so there I'm
Oh,
the real Tea
no.
for Me Please.
Okay.
um,
Can you repeat the TikTok one again? I'm
sure,
sorry.
the real Tea for Me Please.
A real tea for me, please.
Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect.
And then my book is called The Tea Recipe Book, and you can find it on Amazon, or, I've had a lot of people have their local bookstores order it for them, which is always a great way to do because that way you support a small business also.
Excellent. Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much. This was such an amazing conversation. And look, I can't wait to have you back on. I think we need to do a part two, because I would love to share, first of all, the matcha whipped cream recipe. I think that's going to be amazing. But I have some other ideas too for incorporating teas into cooking. So we may have to do a
Absolutely.
part two. But thank you again so much, Nicole. This was so much fun.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. I really hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. I loved having Nicole here, sharing all of her knowledge and educating us on tea. And of course, I want to give a big shout out to our community members over in our Facebook group. They submitted some really great questions for me to ask Nicole. If you're not a part of our group, please join us. You can find our Facebook group at Cook the Garden Cooking and Gardening Tips. Hey friends, are you looking for new and exciting ways to elevate your cooking skills? Or maybe you need some inspiration in the kitchen. I have now launched monthly virtual cooking classes where we have the opportunity to cook together, and I walk you through steps of how to make delicious, simple, yet seasonal meals for you and your family. Visit my website at cookprayslay.com under the Cooking Classes tab. That's where you'll find all of the information for my cooking classes. In honor of Women's History Month, I'm offering 10% off of my cooking classes. In your cart, just include the code Women's Month 10. I'll include this information in the show notes as well. Thank you for tuning in to this week's Cook the Garden. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a 5-star review. As a new podcast, it really helps to add value while growing our awesome community. As always, I really appreciate it. Until next time, friends, keep slaying those garden fresh recipes.